There's been around 6 seasons since the 2018 trade window, and I am here to discuss and grade every single trade now that we do have hindsight. Now, the first trade, getting right into this, was Lincoln McCarthy. Now, he went from Brisbane to Geelong, effectively for around a pick 50. Injury problems absolutely ruined him at Geelong, so he didn't have much trade value anyway. So Geelong basically had no option. Give him a fresh start. He's been great for Brisbane. I'm also ranking these, or grading them, sorry, based on what the team that chose them got. So I'm not doing this on Geelong's side, like how much did they get for getting rid of Lincoln McCarthy. It's how much has Lincoln McCarthy done for Brisbane, given what what was given up for him. And it's been a good trade for Brisbane and for him. He's done really well. He's played 114 games. He's been fucking class. Let's give that trade a A. Albeit that, the injury problems were a bit scary for Brisbane, but he's been pretty fit. Wow, this is a throwback. Corey Ellis and Anthony Miles. What the fuck? Now, Gold Coast got both Corey Ellis and Anthony Miles from the Richmond Football Club. Ellis played 4 games. Miles played 17 games. Richmond got a pick 46 who they ended up choosing Hugo Ralph-Smith for. It's a bit, in fact, it's a fucking massive L from Gold Coast. Look, they didn't lose much. I mean, in terms of the grand scheme of things, like when you look at the actual trade, Gold Coast dub up. But I mean, Ellis and Miles, based off what they've done for Gold Coast, it's been a pretty horror show for them. And to be completely honest, I don't even know why they chose Corey Ellis in the first place. Anthony Miles, I did get, he was pretty decent for Richmond. That trade probably gets a D. Yeah, we'll give that trade a D. Moving on, Nathan Kruger. Now, Nathan Kruger, was, he went to Geelong from Carlton for pick 42. Fucking hell, I can barely speak. Albeit Carlton lost this trade, Geelong definitely dub up. He is now playing for Collingwood. He was decent, showed glimpses at Geelong. I think he would get a B, maybe a C plus actually. I feel like C plus is pretty fair, given that Kruger has always had his injury problems. Moving on to a big trade. This was, one of the biggest trades throughout the window from memory. It had to do with the Port Adelaide and North Melbourne trade. Jasper Pittard and Jared Polec, both very good for Port Adelaide. In particular, Jared Polec was a phenomenal player for Port Adelaide on that wing, and his trade value was enormous at that time. North Melbourne gave up a fuck ton for both of those players. We've got pick 11 and a round 4 for, Pittard, Polec, and a pick 48. So North Melbourne, they didn't lose all too much. Now, Pittards and Polec have been woeful for North. Polec playing 42 games, Pittard playing 33 games. It is an E. Like, the trade simply has to get an E given how bad both have been for North. But given they got pick 48 in return for pick 11 and round 4 pick, it's not all too bad. And now we're not involving draft pick trades. This is all players. We have got a trade for Shane McAdam and Mitch McGovern. And this is the 3-way trade involving Sydney as well. Adelaide, they get Shane McAdam. Carlton, they get Mitch McGovern. Sydney, they get a bunch of picks. Mitch McGovern, look, Carlton lose this trade big time. Massive trade loss. They do get McGovern, but they give up a fuck ton for him. Pick 13's involved in that. McAdam with Sydney. Sydney dub up this trade as well as Adelaide. McAdam's been pretty decent for Adelaide. Obviously now is at Melbourne, I believe. But McGovern, I mean, what a guy. I mean, he was so good for Adelaide. So much promise. Obviously, his older brother, Jeremy McGovern, is just a star player. And he goes to Carlton, where people believe he's going to flourish. He's on a massive contract, and Carlton lose his trade. I mean, in terms of the Mitch McGovern trade, we'll do this one in isolation, not together like the other ones, because they do play for different clubs. The Mitch McGovern trade gets an F, like a complete fail of a trade. He could turn that into an E, maybe a D if he starts to play good footy, but, he's never shown to be the player that he promised. And Shane McAdam, we'll give that trade a B. Nothing too special about that, but Adelaide definitely dub up. Carlton lose, and Sydney are just sort of there, kind of winning. Next up, we have got a trade which took Gary Rohan from Sydney to Geelong. Pretty simple one here. Gary Rohan went to Geelong for pick 61. Now, at the time, it makes sense. Gary Rohan is such an interesting player where he can be so good, yet so bad. Like, in grand finals or big games, he disappears, and then, sometimes he turns into prime Ronaldo, prime Messi. I mean, this guy looks like the best player in the comp. Geelong definitely win this trade, purely because he's played nearly 90 games. He was there during that flag season for the flag, and he's been a pretty decent performer for them, albeit there have been question marks, but that's what you get with Gary Rohan. I think this trade, in terms of Geelong and what they got, he's played well, probably gets an A, but I mean, Sydney didn't have a choice to get rid of him though. Pretty boring trade next, Ryan Clark. He went from North Melbourne to Sydney. He's played 60 games for Sydney, nearly, and North Melbourne got picked 61. Fail, big L, big L. I mean, Sydney basically have used this trade to get him in. Big L for North Melbourne, I think. You know what? Actually, it's not even a bigger. What the fuck am I talking about? Ryan Clark's just been a role player for them. He's probably worth pick 61. I'll give this trade I was originally thinking C+. Maybe that's a bit harsh because he has played a lot, but you know what? We'll stick with a C+. The next trade involves Tom Hickey, who went to one of his 4 clubs. Tom Hickey went to West Coast from St Kilda during this trade period. A lot of picks involved. Pick 39 in round 4 went to St Kilda. West Coast got Hickey, pick 60, and a round 4. Effectively, you're getting Hickey and pick 60 for a pick 39. Pretty minimal trade here. West Coast probably win this trade, but St Kilda, I'm not sure who they use pick 39 for. It doesn't say here. Usually it does. But West Coast, they got a decent player. Let's give that trade a B. Next up, we got a pick that, or trade that involves Dan Hanbury. An unfortunate trade because didn't really do much for St Kilda. I mean, he was so injured at Sydney. He needed a change of scenery, I guess. St Kilda got Hanbury and pick 28. Sydney got pick 39 and a round 2. So, I mean, relatively speaking, it's sort of around a round 2, maybe a little bit less that Sydney got. Was he worth it? No. It says he has played 18 games. That's not it. Probably gets an E. Dean Kent went from Melbourne to St Kilda, pick 65, a pretty stinky one here. You know, it's just a pretty boring trade. Yeah, he's been all right for St Kilda, but you know, that's what you get for pick 65. It's a C, it's bog standard. Also, bog standard is the trade. Jeez, this trade window, it stinks. I mean, this is a fucking boring trade window. Jesus Christ. I mean, Braden Bruce and Dom Tyson were involved in a trade. Bruce went from North Melbourne to Melbourne, as well as pick 62, and North Melbourne got Dom Tyson. Dom Tyson, useless. Bruce, not useless, but just not that great. I mean, both Bruce and Dom Tyson, despite playing for both clubs, those trades each, let's give them an E. I mean, they're just so boring. Maybe a D. I feel like a D is more fair. So D it is. Once again, another boring trade. Doesn't even play for Carlton anymore, but Will Setterfield went from GWS to Carlton. I remember at the time, a lot of people were talking about Will Setterfield as a potential star. And not that he's been a flop or nothing, but he's just not shown anything. I mean, he's at Essendon now, where hopefully he's going to be looking to find a position there through the midfield. In terms of this trade, Carlton got Setterfield and pick 71. GWS got pick 43, around 2, and that's it. Who wins this trade? I mean, GWS chose 2 players that have not played at all for them. So probably, no one really wins. I mean, at the time, Carlton definitely won this trade. Don't get me wrong. We'll give this trade a C. I feel like a C is fair. Sam Lloyd, I mean, he went from Richmond, such a cult figure at Richmond, goes to the Dogs for pick 64. Pretty boring trade. We chose Turner, who played 0 games. No one wins. He played 32 games for the Dogs. It gets a D+. Aaron Hall, another boring trade, went from Gold Coast to North Melbourne. Hall did go for pick 68. So Gold Coast lose. I mean, Hall's played nearly 60 games. He's been, you know, a pretty big contributor throughout his time at North. I think it's a decent trade for North. North definitely win this. Probably be giving that trade just because Hall's been pretty decent and pick 68 is nothing, like absolutely nothing. Let's get that trade a B+. Jack Scrimshaw, such a high draft pick. He goes from Gold Coast to Hawthorn. Gold Coast get pick or a round 3 and Hawthorn get a round 4 and Scrimshaw in return. This has to be one of the worst trades of all time for Gold Coast. Let me say that again. Scrimshaw, who has played nearly 80 games at Hawthorn, he is a very important defender for them. Everyone knew this. He was high in the trade. We all knew he was going to be a good player. Gold Coast gave up Scrimshaw and a round 4 for a round 3. You know how fucking dumb that is? That is the worst trade in history. Gold Coast get an absolute beyond an F. I don't even know if letters go low. If numbers don't go that low, that is so bad. It's an A+ for Hawthorn and Scrimshaw though. So that trade gets an A+. Pretty boring trade. George Holland-Smith, he played 7 games with Gold Coast. He came from Geelong. Geelong got pick 59. Yeah, Gold Coast got him. It's such a boring E. Tyson Stengel. Now this is an interesting one because this isn't involving Geelong. This is involving Adelaide. Adelaide got Stengel, who only played 14 games, but he really disrupted the culture of that club with some of his off-field incidents, and he just wasn't a great player for them. For Richmond, we got pick 68, or Richmond got pick 68. Sorry, I say we, I go for them. And to be completely honest, at the time, I was pretty disappointed losing Stengel. Unfortunately, throughout that period, Shea Bolton, Dan Butler, Jason Castagna, Daniel Rioli, those small forwards all were ahead of Tyson Stengel. And it's quite ironic now that Richmond don't have good small forwards because Rioli's moved to the back line, Castagna's retired, Adelaide. Higgins and Dan Butler, I didn't mention Higgins before, but Higgins and Dan Butler have both said, fuck this, they're going to St Kilda. Shea Bolton's through the midfield now, and Tyson Stengel is now one of the best or better small forwards in the comp for Geelong. Actually, definitely not one of the best, but a pretty decent one. It's actually, like, in terms of what Adelaide got, the trade gets an E. It just does get an E because it failed, and you know what, to be completely honest, it's bad trade for everyone. I feel like if he stayed at Richmond, his opportunity would have come, but you know what, he's doing well now at Geelong, which is a credit to him because it's his third club and he's finally found his feet. Now, this is actually a pretty big trade. A trade involving a guy who had some problems with Patton, Tom Scully. Now, Tom Scully, this is the trade where, not from Melbourne to GWS, but GWS to Hawthorn. The GWS Giants got a round 4 pick. Hawthorn got Tom Scully. Overall, pretty boring trade. I mean, Giants didn't even use that pick, I don't think. Hawthorn, he played 35 games for them. Obviously retired very early for some suspicious reasons with sisters involved, but we won't get into that. Purely because he retired early and, you know, he really disrupted the culture at Hawthorn. I'm going to be giving that trade, not much was given up for him. Let's give it a D. Taylor Dre went from Hawthorn to the Dogs. He's been great for the Dogs. Nearly 80 games played, reliable defender. Hawthorn only got, well, the Dogs only gave up round 4 pick, a future round 4 to Hawthorn. It's a big dub for the Western Bulldogs, that trade. I'm honestly going to give it an A. I feel like an A is pretty fair for that trade. Next up, the Ryan Burton trade and the Chad Wingard trade. Traded clubs. Wingard from Port Adelaide to Hawthorn, and then we got Ryan Burton from Hawthorn to Port Adelaide. Quick recap of this trade. Hawthorn got Wingard in a round 3, and then Port Adelaide got Burton, a round 15, a round 35, and a round 4. Port Adelaide definitely win this trade. Wingard's only played 71 games. Burton's played more at 92 games, and has probably been more consistent, and he is younger, so that's a better trade in that sense. And then Hawthorn only getting a round 3, where the Port Adelaide Football Club get a pick 15, a round 4, and a pick 35. In terms of the Ryan Burton trade and everything involved with it, that trade gets an A. In terms of the Wingard trade, I'll give it a B. He's still been good for them, but I mean, Hawthorn gave up way too much for Wingard. Next up, such a dead trade. I mean, Sam Mays, what a boring trade. Sam Mays goes from Brisbane to Port Adelaide. Brisbane get a pick 6. What? A pick 6, a pick 35, and a round 3. Port Adelaide get Mays and a pick 5. Now, quite interestingly, that pick number 6 was used for, I believe, King, who's played 80 games for one of the St Kilda Gold Coast. But Port Adelaide, big dub. Not only did they get Mays, who's only played 20 games for them, and then they got Rosie. For that pick 5 that Brisbane gave them, they got Rosie. So we're talking about one of the trades of the century. Very, very smart recruiting there. Overall, the Mays trade, in terms of what he did nothing, okay? Like, in 20 games, there's no influence. But, I mean, getting Rosie on the bar, we're not going to base it on the Rosie pick, though. We're going to sort of more base this on the player. And you could probably say for Mays, Brisbane got pick 35 in a round 3, which actually is kind of a lot. We'll get this trade a C. It's actually pretty boring, but all the little, you know, the draft picks involved make it pretty cool. Oh my God. Okay. I didn't even see this, but this trade, it's starting to heat up, this trade window. Lachie Neale went from Fremantle to Brisbane. Fucking massive move there. Brisbane get Neale, a pick 30. Fremantle get a pick 6, a pick 19, and a pick 55. So you could probably average that out as, you know, probably a pick 10 or so, I would say, for Neale, which is definitely not worth it in hindsight. 2 Brownlows at Brisbane. Brisbane win this trade. Neale to Brisbane. Fremantle get an F, but the Brisbane trade for Neale gets an A+. Easy as the alphabet. Now, Jesse Hogan, if I recorded this a year ago, I would give a different grade for this. Now, Hogan went from Melbourne to Fremantle. Fremantle got Hogan pick 65. Melbourne got pick 6 and pick 23. Very embarrassing initially for Jesse Hogan. Actually, what am I talking about? He's doing well for GWS, not for Fremantle. It's an F. Fremantle, they get absolutely rinsed to pick 6 and 23. Big fat L. And Hogan, I mean, unfortunately, he didn't find his feet there, but he's playing good footy at GWS, which is good. But the Fremantle-Hogan trade gets an F, one of the worst ones at the window. Even worse, you could argue, because he's now left Fremantle as well. Fucking Fremantle have had a stinker. Fremantle in this trade period, they lost Lachie Neale, and they got Hogan for fucking way too many draft picks and high draft picks. They also picked up Rory Lob from the GWS Giants, who eventually also, like Jesse Hogan, left to a 3rd club. Lob's now playing for the Dogs. But anyway, during this time, Fremantle got Lob, pick 14, pick 43, and pick 47 for a pick 11 and a pick 19. So, you know, you could probably average that out at like a pick in the mid-10s, like 15 or so. Overall, is it worth it? No, not at all. Because he leaves after, you know, just over 60 games, which I guess is a decent amount for Fremantle, but he was meant to be their star boy, the forward ruck, the guy who's going to, you know, carry your team. It fails. It gets I'm going to give it let's give it a D. I feel like because he's played 66 games, you can't be too harsh on him. Another really big trade involving Stephen May and Cade Colyer. Basically, Melbourne get Colyer and May from Gold Coast, and Gold Coast got pick number 6. Who wins? Probably Melbourne, because May and Colyer won on the flag. The May trade gets an A+. The Colyer trade gets an F. Injuries, concussion, really unfortunate. But Gold Coast won't be crying too much because they did get pick 6, who was used on King. And King's, you know, obviously going to be one of the best players in the next 10 years. Jack Humph, really boring trade. Went from Port Adelaide to Gold Coast around 4. Boring. C. Like literally so boring. Jackson Thurlow, even more boring. Geelong get pick 70. Thurlow goes from Geelong to Sydney. He plays 17 games. It gets a C+, not a B+. Boring, but I mean, he played a little bit, so we'll give him a bit more than a C. Marcus Adams, another awfully boring trade. I mean, at the time, this was actually kind of cool because, you know, Adams was a good defender for the Dogs, but he goes to Brisbane. He's only played less than 50 games. He's retired now. Didn't go as well as planned. The Dogs got pick 32 around 3 as well, and, you know, Brisbane get Adams. I honestly think the Dogs win this, so therefore Brisbane lose. Adams lost out in that trade. I'm going to give it a D+. Jordan Roughhead went from the Dogs to Collingwood for pick 75. Was great for Collingwood, you know. Really good. What can I say? He played over 60 games, you know, nearly helped them to success, and that trade gets a B+. Actually, you know what? That trade gets an A, because pick 75 for a proven guy is absolutely crazy to me in hindsight. More boring trades. I mean, this trade period has actually, in hindsight, been extremely boring. Travis Colyer, I mean, who remembers that name? Goes from Essendon to Speed Demon. Round 4, Essendon get Fremantle to get Travis Colyer. He's played nearly 60 games, so let's get that trade a B. Dylan Shield. Now, this was one of the best trades of the window because there was so much involving it. Obviously, Dylan Shield for GWS was an amazing player, but he's gone to Essendon and kind of stunk up the gaff. He hasn't even got to 80 games yet, and it's been, what, 5-6 seasons? So it's not good. Now, just to, you know, recap the trade, Essendon got Shield and a round 2. GWS got a pick 9 and a future round 1. So GWS win. They win the trade. For them, you know, you're thinking of an A+. Essendon, it's just been unfortunate. It's probably a D, which is sad because he promised so much, but he delivered so little. Nick Newman now, actually a quite fun trade. He's played 80 games for Carlton. He went from Sydney. Sydney got a round 4 from Carlton. Carlton win this trade. I'm going to give this trade an A+, because if you're given a future round 4 for a reliable guy, Nick Newman, who's played 80 games, what more do you want? That's actually one of the better trades of the window. And you could argue, wouldn't be mad if you argue that's the best steal of the window. A famous one here, Dane Beams, for a lot of different reasons, family reasons. He wanted to come back to Collingwood, to Victoria. Got to do with his dad, from Brisbane. Now, Brisbane got pick 18, pick 56 in a round 1. Dane Beams went to Collingwood alongside a pick 41 and a pick 44. Who wins? Probably Brisbane. But feels weird grading this trade because, you know, we're going to give this an NA, all right? Because I don't want to grade this because this is more sort of Beams had to come back for family reasons. You know, there's no doubt Brisbane won the trade, but, you know, it's just unfortunate what happened. And I believe everything else is draft picks, which means that is the 2018 AFL trade window, I guess, graded every trade. Let me know in the comments if you agree with all my different gradings. So write it down there. Where have I gone wrong? Where have I gone right? Make sure you like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Follow the TikTok FTFooty. Thank you for watching. I'll be